the structure of this panel is a conversation that I get the opportunity to guide and shape. So I have a series of questions, just kind of provocations that I'd like to kind of put out here for Doug and John, in part because they just finished a new book, and it came out in January, called A New Culture of Learning, Cultivating the Imagination for a World in Constant Change. And I've been watching this book develop. I have spent many days myself kind of in their previous publications, thinking about it, working through their ideas and so on. And I haven't had a chance to have kind of more of a conversation with them. So Jonathan, I want to thank you for hosting this conference so that I could get a chance to talk to these two guys, because it's been about a year and a half I've been trying to get together with them in the same space-time continuum. Yes, no, that's what I'm saying, face-to-face, because, you know, one on asynchronous doesn't get us in conversation as easily. So this book is really interesting. It is a culmination of pieces that I've seen in different, published in different places. And it was at one point going to be something like a 300-page book, and it has been distilled to some incredibly kind of interesting and very kind of laser-sharp ideas in about a 118-page book. So what I'd like to do is get them to kind of get into that book, talk a little bit about this, and kind of start us off with just what the project is. So the title of the book, A New Culture of Learning. So I've got to ask the question, what do you mean by a culture of learning? And then, of course, why do we need a new culture of learning? So can I?
Sure.
You're good. Okay.
I must say, I like having a wire attached to my mic. Rocket alters spin around. So, you know, that term was a really important one to us, and it didn't start off that way, but the deeper we got into thinking about this book and this project, the more we started playing with the very idea of culture. And it started off in the kind of straight anthropological sense, which is you know, building off of some of the work that Mimi Ito was doing, where she was actually looking at what people were doing with technology and trying to figure out what cultures were emerging around digital technology, particularly among youth. So this is all very interesting to us and fit very well with our project. And then we came upon some other work, and it started to suggest that we might have to think about culture in a second sense. And that second sense of culture is the way you think of a culture in a petri dish. And that struck us as a metaphor that had a lot of power. And the sense of that petri dish has two interesting properties. The first is that it's absolutely bounded. It is a glass container that has substrate or a medium in it for things to grow. But in order for a petri dish to work and for you to trust the results, you have to let whatever happens inside the dish evolve on its own. So you have this combination of a bounded environment with almost unlimited kind of potential for growth inside that environment. And we thought, if we could have classrooms that started to look like that, that could be a really powerful concept. And a lot of this, too, was in response to this sort of utopian notion that everything's out on the internet, and we just let kids loose on Wikipedia and on Google, that they'll learn everything they need to know. And we thought that wasn't quite right either. But the idea of having that resource that you could pour into that petri dish and then watch what happens, that struck us as a really important concept. So partly what you get then is some shifting of roles. And the idea of a new culture of learning was particularly important to us, because we thought what we have today in the classroom is really a culture of teaching. Right? Is that we are assuming that the way education works is that somebody stands up who knows more and tells people who know less things, and then we measure what percentage of that information is transferred. You know, and if it's 70%, we give them a C and on up. But it doesn't really give us much insight into what learning is. So we thought this metaphor of the petri dish starts to describe a process where learning can be something we kind of tackle head on, and that's really what the book became about, I think. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I just add two things to that. In a world of constant change, the willingness to constantly be experimenting and not expected to be an authority telling you stuff becomes increasingly more important. And so the mechanisms that make a petri dish actually work became, to us, very suggestive of how we should be thinking about connecting the dots in a world in which no one yet quite knows how to connect the dots. But the second thing is, people keep asking, how is this practical? Because after all, if you try to do full inquiry method teaching or learning, as Singapore has discovered, teachers are used to being the authority. But in this kind of scheme of the new culture that we're talking about, basically the kids are be asking question after question after question, which means that the teachers are probably going to constantly be put on stage and say, I don't know. Now, how do you actually turn that into a plus, where now the teachers and the kids together come together to try to really figure out, what is the answer? How do you navigate this information space to kind of connect the dots to make sense of something? So that was one aspect, and let me just say quickly the second. You see throughout our whole book and many things that Doug has really pioneered, is that we're looking for constant ways to transform constraints into a resource. We keep talking about the petri dish as a bounded environment, or imagination comes from bounds. And I was really struck when I first went to Bilbao to look at Frank Gehry's work. And I went down to see where his museum was. Pardon me. And then the person I was with, an architect, actually two, my wife being an architect, pointed up on the hill, beautiful hillside, across the river, virgin territory. And he said, we offered Frank that space. It was an unbounded space that he would have to do anything he wanted. Well, Frank would do. He said, no. I want to be down here at this bridge, the most constrained environment you can believe. And that actually, I think, stimulated me to take those constraints into fantastic resources to build something that we've never seen. So I think there's something about this whole sense of how do you honor the constraint, but how do you use that as a way to stimulate the imagination? We wanted to also be able to pull out through this new culture.
Let's talk a little bit about this notion of the petri dish as the site or the architecture for the spaces of learning, because what I hear and where my mind goes when you think about that is that as a teacher who wants to now be inspired by this metaphor, I would, to do my own shift in thinking from teaching to learning, that what my responsibility would be in architecting the petri dish, right? That I would be the one now, not so much as the single source of authority, but more the architect of where the boundaries are, whether that's a physical space or an intellectual space or a disciplinary domain space or a space defined by questions. These are the key themes of our learning adventure. These are our key questions we will explore here. So I would be an architect of a bounded space. That's a different role for me to play than an authority figure. And I would be, this is the other thing I'm thinking, when the authority lines can come from many channels. Right, we've got Wikipedia, and we've got YouTube, and we've got Twitter feeds now, and we've got kind of mobile apps and so on. We've got our informal groups. Then I'm not the final authority figure, but I am the one who orchestrates understandings about competing claims to authority, perhaps including my own as the teacher. So I'm sure these things come up in the book about talking about what do you say to teachers? What role do they play kind of in this kind of transformed culture of learning?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I'll make it a little bit personal in the sense that I'm trying to put a lot of these practices into the classroom, and I think of myself as somebody who's really on board with all of these ideas. I wrote a book about it, and I am constantly racked with guilt at the feeling that I'm not teaching enough, and that I'm not doing my job fully, that I'm, every time I give them authority in the classroom or too much power or the ability to explore, I get very nervous because I feel like somehow, that's not what I'm being paid to do. So it's a very strange feeling. And just yesterday, in fact, well, a week before, I'm teaching a class on communication, technology, and culture. And the students were asking what their final paper was going to be like and so on. And one of them said, I think half jokingly, could we write the paper prompt for the final paper? And I said, absolutely. In fact, we'll take half the class next week and we'll do it. And it was really interesting to watch them do that, and really hard for me to sit there and keep my mouth shut while they argued back and forth. And what I found myself doing is that I felt like they were straying a little bit from where they needed to go, I would kind of gently nudge. So I think in one way, the role of the teacher then is to kind of be a guardrail, right? When you see them going off the cliff, right, you nudge them back. Another is to be a mentor and to recognize in those students different dispositions and figure out how you provide the nutrients into the environment to nurture that growth. And one of the examples in the book, we talk about a teacher looking at 3 students playing piano. Right? So the first one plays the scales and bangs it out furiously. And the second one plays it very, very delicately and lightly and crisply. And the third one plays the scale, but they're doing something else too, and it's a little strange. And for us, the teacher says there's a rock pianist, there's a concert pianist, and there's a jazz pianist. And today's teacher says, oh my God, they're all doing it wrong. So the ability to look at each student and find what they need and mentor them in that way, I think fits, again, with that notion of the petri dish as a kind of set of nutrients to allow growth. And you can't dictate what that growth should look like. You have to let it follow its course. But at the same time, we're still talking about piano. We're still talking about the scales. We're still talking about music. We're still talking about certain things that are important. And exercises, yeah. But now they're having fun doing it, and they're following their passions, right? And that's what the book's about.
But one twist I'd add to that, I'd add 2 twists. One is that Doug yesterday launched a blog site. That's blogging kind of the experiences he's actually going through himself as he's constantly living these experiments. That I think will really, somehow by doing the book, it kind of authorized you to admit publicly that these experiments were going on.
But yeah, there's a book.
Right. So, it's a great blog. But I think it's another shift is the shift from teaching, you brought up, to cultivating. And that's why the word cultivation is so important. In the title, the subtitle, culture and cultivation. So the real question is, we as leaders and teachers are trying to cultivate imagination in our workforce, in our school force, and so on and so forth, our students. And I think that we have to think pretty seriously what leads to that kind of effective cultivation, which is quite different than the usual push model of teaching. It's obvious at some level, but that word was chosen pretty carefully because I think it is meant to be evocative for all kinds of things.
And so I need to kind of push you to the segue between the focus of the individual and thinking about individual learning styles. We've talked about dispositions and so on, to notions of collaboration, because of course that's the bridge that we that I think is also kind of really focused on in the book, is that, and in fact, going back to Dimitri's this simple point about the individual is always multiple, and there's one thing thinking about the sensibility of different learning styles and different kind of biographies and so on, and all those things that come kind of with us when we enter into a classroom space. And then there's the next step, which is how we get them to work in concert with one another. So the jazz pianist and the rock pianist may not be the people who are going to show up in the trio. So what do we do?
One of the ideas that's sort of fundamental to what we're talking about is the concept of the collective. And this idea is a kind of radical break from what we've constantly constructed as kind of the valued sense of participation, which has been the notion of community. And the way we've kind of mapped this is by looking at the relationship between what we talk about as institution and agency. And communities generally are designed, to build communities. So you subjugate your individual agency into a greater project, right? Which is, whatever the institution is, you want to build that and be a part of it for a sense of belonging. And what we've seen in the digital world, and more in this world of change, is the notion of the power of collectives. And collectives don't have the same kind of investment. In fact, they work the opposite way. So collectives are platform spaces that invest agency in individuals. Right? So if you look at something like Facebook, right, nobody wants to go out and say, I'm a Facebooker, right? They're not invested in that site. And if a better thing comes along, ask MySpace, right? People will jump ship instantly. But what they like about it is that they control their activity feed, that it gives them a huge amount of agency. They get to define their identity. They get to define who's in and who's out. So it becomes a tool for them to express themselves. Blogs do very much the same kind of thing. So we find all kinds of learning environments happening in the digital world around this notion of a collective. And it's not geared around the same kind of reciprocity that a community is. So if I, call you up and say, I really need your help on something, can you read my essay or whatever, I'm kind of indebted to you, right? And the expectation that when you have your essay, it's going to, we're going to have a kind of relationship because we're both invested in part of a community and we're Trojans, whatever. But that's really different than when I'm on a listserv and I say, gosh, I got to give a lecture on Andre Bergson tomorrow, and I don't really know what any good sources are. And you get 30 emails back from people you've never heard from before. It's, oh, here's what you got to read. But there's no sense that, oh God, now I'm indebted to these 30 people, and when they have a project, I'm going to have to, it's whoever can contribute, contributes. And that's the kind of mode of participation. It's very different. It also means that these things don't have the same kind of inertia that most institutions do. So they can form, they can change, they can grow, and they can disband without much kind of impact. So they're very flexible, but they're able to adapt quickly to different changes, different evolutions, different environments.
So the surprising thing is, given the prior panel, that what Doug just laid out is there's a really kind of an ontological break between the notion of community versus collective. There's been a lot of talk about how people use this term as almost collective and community and coexist. What I'm really suggesting is the investment structure is really radically different. And I think that's going to behoove us as we move forward to kind of understand what the nuances are between these two entities. The curious thing is that in some ways the collective also gets better by giving me advice and seeing my response to it. So you've got a kind of a dual type of learning going on in these collectives that has an interesting dynamic to it as well. But I think that the key here, and one of the things that got us into this originally, is the premise of our book, to a large extent, is that and much of the premise of the prior panel is the world is changing so rapidly that our skill base, the half-life of most of our skills, have collapsed from 30 years to maybe 5 years. Now think what that actually means, because if we really collapsed that much, people would say, well, now you have to go meta. And if you go meta, you got to learn about learning. Well, maybe not. Nothing wrong with learning about learning, but if I'm spending 4 years here, I want to learn about learning, that's not necessarily very effective. The catch is, how do you start to pick up a disposition that says, I have to find a way to constantly reframe things. I have to be willing to kind of pick up knowledge on the fly, but be willing to kind of challenge my own set of assumptions about this and back to the constraints. And what's so powerful about the collectives is that as we look around in a lot of the cases we study, is that people have been using these collectives, not even talking about it much, to constantly be picking up, brand new types of skills all along. And one of our key simple examples is a 60-year-old guy who majored in computer science 40 years ago, runs his own company, and is continuously, because I've had a long chance to not track him now, anything new, always being able to pick up the latest set of skills, and always picking up the newest languages and so on and so forth. But you go and you talk to him, you say, well, did you go back to school, or did you go to kind of conferences to learn this? The response was, why would I do that? I simply jump in and try it, and guess what happens, John? As soon as I write a piece of code, I get an error comment. So what do? Is I turn around and take this stupid error code, which means nothing to anybody, thank God, because now I can type it into Google, and up comes hundreds of people's responses to how to think about that. And so he's constantly learning all his new ability to program through the kinds of how the collective here is actually functioning, and completely dauntless about picking up something new. And that sense of being willing to go out and pick up something on his own, relative to the collective, not really on his own, and I think it's turned out to be very kind of inspiring for how might you live in a world of constant change.
Okay, you guys are probably not going to be surprised at my next question, but boy, this sounds really rationalist to me, and it sounds really good for the model of information acquisition and information exchange. And I'm not hearing a different connotation to the notion of collective, which is the 60s notion of collective, that I need. And I think it does go back to the earlier panel, interrogating the notion of the social. And for me, the social is not just who can I get the information to give me the sense about my code error. I want to know who's gonna be there for me, emotionally as well as intellectually, when I need a casserole because my spouse has died, my mother has died, my so has died. So there is a sense of community that I think gets lost when we turn to only looking at things kind of as mediated by information networks. So I know that there's a strand here that you can walk down, which is an earlier hippie version notion of collectivist and collectives that isn't kind of as bloodless or as disembodied as just that kind of notion of information farming.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting dynamics that we took a long time to figure out what the relationship between these two terms was. And I'm not sure, community and collective. And I'm still not sure that we've absolutely nailed it, because it seems to be kind of a movable feast in some ways. But one of the things that's really interesting is it's very clear that collectives afford community. So, World of Warcraft was an easy example for us because we both looked at it a lot. And if you look at World of Warcraft, the game itself and everything that happens around the game is a great example of collectives. You go into that game and find a high-end raiding guild. Those people know each other in real life. They're on 5, 6, 7 days a week. They're really tight and they're there for each other. And I was in a couple of guilds where people helped other players through their divorces, which was largely a result of them playing World of Warcraft successfully. But I mean, it doesn't get more personal than that. So I don't want us to think about collective and community as oppositional terms. But I think what we really need to do is map out that relationship between agency, what these things allow us to do, the motives attached to that, and the institutions as they form. Because the notion of institution as a long-standing thing is really starting to break down, in large part because the world's changing so fast. A great example from the power of pull was the Standard & Poor 500, which you'll have to give the numbers on this, but the average life of one of these companies used to be 75 years, and now it's down to, what, 15?
Probably headed closer to 5.
To 5. So this notion of rapid change is not only the world is changing around us, but in this bizarre twist on Gandhi, we are the change that we're wanting to see in the world, because everything we add, every time we go to Google News and select a story, we're changing Google News. And it's a collection of millions of microtransactions that we're all participating in that start to shape what that site looks like. So one of the reasons this is the world is changing so fast and so constantly is everything we do tends to change it and tends to reshape the context, not just the content. And that's another concept that we play a lot with. It also makes it really difficult to think about teaching or teaching meta skills, because they both work for content even if it's changing, but they don't help us very much in a world where context is constantly changing and that meaning's made more through context than content.
Now we have amazing tools to be able to shape and create context around any particular piece of content.
Right. So we want to turn it over to have kind of audience questions and so on, and two topics we didn't get to, so perhaps audience questions might also draw us out, is we've got collectives, collaboration. We didn't move to the notion of innovation and entrepreneurship. So now we're starting, and not entrepreneurship in the sense of just business ideas, but really, again, as Z was saying, translating new ideas into impact and reality. So perhaps people in the audience might be interested in asking questions, commenting, throwing out ideas about how we do make the connection between collectives and innovation. Sarah. And there is a mic right there.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. So I'm going to take up Anne's charge to ask the question about entrepreneurialism, but actually, and Doug, you're going to hate me for asking you this, but I'm wondering if you could kind of tell me how to make the classroom a more collective experience, not as an experiment and not as a model, but as a norm. Because as you know, since we are colleagues in this university, that collectivity or collaboration or cultivation or cooperative learning is a lot of it, we realize its importance, but a lot of it is rhetoric and not always practice, and there are kind of real consequences for challenging the kind of normative model of education here. So in the spirit of entrepreneurialism and in the spirit of redefining entrepreneurialism, not from a business point of view, but from a cooperative or a collective point of view, can you tell me how to do that?
Read the book. Well, I mean, it's hard because our institutions are structured not to do that, right? I got a really interesting email from Josh Kuhn, and he wrote me and said, I came home, I read your book in one sitting, yay Josh, and I scrapped my entire lecture for the next day, and what I did is I went to the blog post they were all making as required by the class, and I picked out from those comments and used those, and this is a large lecture class, as topics for class discussion. He said it was the best class they had all semester. So there's a sense in which the resources are kind of there, but I think we're very tempted to say, you must blog. And then we let the blog go and say, look how good we are about it. But we never really reintegrate that back into what we're doing. And boy, it's scary, because if it doesn't work, it really doesn't work. But I think that, we talk a lot about cultivating the imagination of the student, but I think we also need to cultivate the imagination of the faculty. And if you actually sit down with a faculty member and say, if you do anything you wanted, any class you wanted, any exercise you wanted, what would you do? People come up with really wonderful ideas. And it may be for a particular class, it may be for an entire semester, but I think that we don't let ourselves imagine enough. So, I don't think that coming up with a new curriculum is the answer, but I think the freedom to have a more imaginative curriculum is. And we talk all the time, this is another rhetoric, we're not failing enough, right? But I just went through merit review and there was no column for listing my failures. And you know, maybe there should be in some way to say, here are the things I tried that were completely disastrous. And this is what I learned from them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's no virtue in just failing repeatedly. but yeah, right. But yeah, you know, taking the risks and somehow being rewarded for that, because there's no institutional mechanism that does that. So I think there's some structural changes, but I think we don't need to completely change everything about every class that we teach tomorrow. But I do think that there are little things that we can do gradually to start reshaping the way we think about our classes and the way we relate to our students. I had an honor student that came in to write her thesis, and you know, fourth year student, A student, had done amazing work in all of the comm classes, and said, what should I write my thesis on? Which I thought was a perfectly absurd question. How should I know what she should write her thesis on? And I said, well, what do you care about? What are you passionate about? What would you wake up every morning and want to write about? She said, nobody's ever asked me that before. I don't know. She had to go home and think about it for a week. And I thought that was maybe the greatest indictment of higher education that I had ever heard. That in 4 years, no one had ever asked her what she cared about. So maybe that's the place we start. And we start asking our students what they care about and start thinking of ourselves as mentors towards them in taking their passion and putting it in our bounded environment and seeing what pops out of it.
And we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. And I hope in the afternoon sessions some of our corporate partners will not be so shy and come to the microphone.
Michael, you get it.
Oh, great! Wow, amazing discussion. Thank you so much. I'm like teeming with thoughts right now. So I will try to focus in asking both of you. Could you tell us what you think a few or the most important quality is for this new teacher-learner you're talking about, and whether or not this model is applicable not only for the university system, but for the K through 12 system as well, and why or why not?
Let me actually expand your question. Ask it for the K through 12, the higher ed teacher, but I'm going to say also for the corporate world. I actually will start from the corporate world point of view, but it turns out to be the same answer. I think that in a world of constant change we're in today, I think the most important kind of disposition to have is the disposition to be able to listen with humility. Because our ability to be able to listen across disciplines, across silos, across students and faculty, et cetera, is a whole sense of saying, like, you know, how do I listen but not react defensively, but it doesn't make any sense right away. How do I let that kind of seep in that and marinate in that question for a moment? And I just think this whole sense of the importance of listening with humility is probably the key to a lot of the new types of innovation we want to talk about. And as a way to kind of break the notion, not just that culture eats strategy, culture eats institutions.
Oh, I want to continue on this, but perhaps we should
I'm
do
not
that.
going to allow you. The timekeeper.
The book has spoken.
Things never
It's
change.
Thank you very
the
much.
man.